Hello from the history of Bangalore. I am Ramjee Chandran and I welcome you to episode 87 of season 2. In our last episode, we follow the language the Mughal occupation left behind in the Bengaluru Pete, Rekta, the mixed tongue that would travel north and become Urdu. Today, we step back from the city itself and look at the kingdom that had just purchased it. When Chikka Devaraja Wadiyar bought Bengaluru, he was the heir to a project that had been quietly underway for half a century. It was a project of building a real state in a region where everyone else was building armies, and this was Mysore. In many ways, the man who started that project was his predecessor, Kantheerava Wadiyar. And the most consequential thing that Kantheerava did was to mint a new coin. That will be today's episode, into which I will plunge. But first, a word of thanks to my sponsors, the Prestige Group, whose support makes this podcast possible. Building cities one landmark at a time, they transform dreams into reality. You can be a part of the future. Simply add prestige to your life. In the 17th century and before, there was no single monetary unit of the kind that we are familiar with today. Money was represented in the form of coins made of gold, silver, and copper, and their value determined largely by the weight and the purity of the metal they contained. The rate of exchange between the currencies of different kingdoms and principalities was pretty straightforward to establish, because the value of any coin rested on the same universal principle, the inherent worth of its metal content. In this monetary environment, the minting of a coin was not merely a commercial act or a representation of goods and services. The issue of a coin was a political declaration. A king who issued his own currency was a king who asserted the right to define value within his territory, to tax, to command labor, to denominate contracts, and to demand that the state's revenue be rendered in the medium of his own creation, largely with his own head on it. In the Deccan of the 17th century, where sovereignty was contested at every level and authority flowed through layered arrangements of delegated power, this was a statement of considerable consequence. I will explain that in simpler terms as we go forward, but it is against this background that the decision of Kantheerava Wadiyar to issue his own currency must be understood. Let's pan out a little bit and just take a look at Mysore from its beginning, because that's what we're talking about. The Wadiyar dynasty of Mysore traces its origins to Yaduraya in the year 1399. For most of the 2.5 centuries that followed, the Wadiyars were feudal lords. They were Wadiyars under the Vijayanagara Empire. After the fall of Vijayanagara, the city, in 1565, and as late as 1612, the Vijayanagara king Venkatapati Raya was formally assigning the regions of Umattur and Srirangapatna to the Wadiyar chief as a hereditary estate. So from this we know that the Wadiyar name still appeared on another empire's ledger, which means that the regions assigned to the Wadiyars were assigned as vassals. But when we read many of the inscriptions that followed, they outline Mysore's gradual transition to independence. For example, by 1616, the first inscription was issued independently by Raja Wadiyar I. Some say it was earlier by Thimmaraja Wadiyar shortly after Talikota, and this inscription appeared at Srirangapatna. There was no imperial authority, which means there was no Vijayanagara kingdom mentioned on it, and the Wadiyar name was the sole author of a sovereign decree. And this is as formal a declaration of independence as any. And by 1639, there was an inscription in Nanjangud which formally traces the Wadiyar family genealogy. They trace it to the Yadu race and the city of Dwaraka, doing what most South Indian dynasties have long done, write their own origin stories. The ruler at the time was Kantheerava Wadiyar I. He is sometimes referred to as the 12th Maharaja of Mysore, but that title is an anachronism. The designation Maharaja came into common use and common historical use only in the 19th century, when the entire land was under British paramountcy. In his own time, Kantheerava was a territorial king. He ruled as his own sovereign, looking towards reducing dependence on any intermediaries. And that was the first time that the whole feudal system started to come apart at the seams. By 1639, when that inscription was issued, Ranadullah Khan, having just handed Bengaluru to Shahaji Bhonsle, turned his army south towards Mysore and laid siege to it. In previous episodes, not too far back, we've gone over in detail about the Battle of Bengaluru when Ranadullah Khan attacked the city. Anyway, at Mysore, a month-long siege followed. It ended not in conquest, but in a cash transaction. Kantheerava paid Ranadullah 500,000 varahas as indemnity to be left alone. Ranadullah accepted the payment and withdrew. 500,000 varahas was a lot of money. The contrast with Bengaluru is instructive. Bengaluru, a larger and more commercially significant city, had been taken by force in 3 days. Mysore paid its way out of a month-long siege and remained its own master. Now both cities survived the same pressure. One survived by changing ownership and the other by buying its independence. And that difference in response tell us the story of where each city was headed in its career. The most historical marker of Kantheerava's reign as far as Bengaluru is concerned was the issue of his own currency, gold coins known as the Kantheerava Varaha, supported by a copper token coin called the Hane Kasu for smaller daily transactions. The first of the Kantheerava Varahas was struck on the 26th of April, 1645. The date was commemorated, which indicates that Kantheerava understood the significance of the act. This was not routine administration, it was a founding moment. And we know this because no one would put the date of the first issue of the coins unless he wanted those coins to last for a very long time. This particular coin, the gold Kantheerava Varaha, carried the image of Lakshmi Narasimha on one face and a 3-line Nagari inscription with the king's name on the other. Its weight, like every Varaha, was 3.4 grams about, consistent, reliable and trusted. Now that coin tied market and tax and sovereignty together into a single bundle that circulated through the hands of every merchant, every farmer and administrator in the kingdom, carrying the king's name into every corner of his territory without the king having to travel there himself. If you think about it from the perspective of the 17th century, when everyone had to go either by foot or in bullock carts, or if they were lucky and senior enough on horseback, this was politically significant. In Mysore, the money circulated inwards. It reinforced the authority that had issued it. This stood in sharp contrast to Bengaluru, where any monetization that happened during the Maratha years served mainly to sustain garrisons and cavalry warfare, and money was moving outwards towards whoever held military command. So where Bengaluru was held through jagirs and garrisons, Mysore was governed through land, tax, and of course, mint. The difference was already asserting itself. Mysore was the political capital of the kingdom, and Bengaluru the commercial capital. The Kantheerava Varaha extended far beyond Kantheerava's own reign. It remained the national currency of Mysore through every administration that followed, through the kings that followed Chikka Devaraja, through the age of the Dalavais, through Hyder, through Tippu, and the British, when they arrived, found the coin so deeply embedded in commercial life of the region that they simply continued to use it, mangling its name as the British reliably mangle Indian names, and started to call it the Kantheerava Pagoda. The Kantheerava Pagoda, or the Kantheerava Varaha, would remain the national currency of Mysore practically until 1834, when the Coinage Act of 1835 introduced uniform currency across the British India, and that was the rupee. So that was about 2 centuries of continuous use, a coin that outlasted the Mughal Empire, the Maratha Confederacy, and the Sultanate of Mysore itself. This wasn't done by chance. This was institutional trust. It was carefully built and consistently maintained. There is one further detail worth noting. When the young Shivaji Bhonsle lived in Bengaluru between 1640 and 1642, He is said to have been so impressed by the independent currency of Kantheerava Wadiyar that later he issued his own coins and named it similarly, the Shivaraya. It was modeled on the Kantheerava. And now for a commercial break, and when I come back, let's move on from Kantheerava and start to talk about Chikka Devaraja right after this.
Maximum connectivity, maximum luxury, maximum lifestyle. Live your max at Prestige Raintree Park. Opulent residences nestled in 21 acres of breathtaking landscape with 1 lakh plus square feet of clubhouse, 3 swimming pools and ample leisure and sports amenities. Experience exquisite living at Prestige Raintree Park in prime Whitefield with schools, offices, hospitals and shopping malls just a hop away. Call 81399 or visit prestigeconstructions.com to know more. Radar approved.
By 1690, Bengaluru slipped through the hands of the Bijapur Sultanate, through the Marathas, into the Mughals, and now Chikka Devaraja Wadiyar, Kantheerava's grandson, bought Bengaluru. What distinguished this purchase from every previous transaction was not the price paid or the manner of his acquisition. It was the intention behind it. Every previous owner had treated Bengaluru as an asset to be extracted from. Chikka Devaraja Wadiyar treated it as a possession to be held and cherished. The price for Bengaluru's purchase is 3 lakh gold varahas. Now it's another matter that you may have heard that Bengaluru was sold for 3 lakh rupees, but that is not really true. 3 lakh gold varahas was significantly more than what one imagines 3 lakh rupees to be. But nonetheless, most of them, of the 3 lakh gold varahas, were Kantheerava varahas. But Chikka Devaraja did not simply receive a city. He received a problem. Bengaluru was a city, ever since after the Kempe Gowdas, had never found a state that was willing to act as its parents, to absorb it and nurture it. All people wanted to do until this point in time was to exploit it. So Chikka Devaraja's first task was to make Bengaluru, for the first time in its history, governable as part of an enterprise. Chikka Deva's first significant act was to address the fort. And the mud structure that Kempe Gowda had built and the fortifications of the Pete itself is punctuated by 8 gates. And there's a reason I mentioned these two things separately. It had served its purpose, and by this I mean the fortifications of the Pete as a defended enclosure for the market's town. But Chikka Deva's vision was different. It was grander. Not a market town with walls, but a military citadel with a dedicated garrison with essential stores and the capacity to function as the first line of defense for Mysore. So he refurbished the fort within the Pete and gave it its distinctive oval shape with which we are familiar today. Now, having said that, I must also mention that there have been disagreements, historiographical disagreements, over whether this was a renovation of Kempe Gowda's fort or an entirely new structure. Two historians, B.N. Sundar Rao and Fazlul Hasan, argue that a separate structure was built to the south of the existing Pete with an esplanade connecting the two. Now, this archaeological question may never be settled, because when Hyder Ali rebuilt the fort entirely in stone many years later in 1761, the earlier mud structures were effectively erased. What is not in question is the function of it. Whether newly built or substantially reworked, Chikka Deva's oval fort appears on every British colonial map of Bengaluru ever drawn. Within the fort, Chikka Deva commissioned the Kote Venkataramana Temple. It's a temple that stands still today. In a city that had experienced repeated changes of ruler, a temple inside the fort now served as a civic anchor, linking his authority to worship, to festival, to community gathering, rather than to coercion alone. It normalized Mysore's presence. It signaled that the authority now resident in this city was not a provisional thing. It was permanent. Authority no longer camped just outside the city walls. It lived within them. The Bengaluru fort and the temple inside were visible statements of intent. This deeper transformation was also administrative. Chikka Deva's ambassadors had visited the Mughal court at Delhi And they returned with descriptions of the Mughal system of government, divided into departments, each with a defined minister, a specific function, a chain of accountability. Now, on the basis of these accounts, Chikka Deva instituted the Attara Kacheri, the 18 departments of government, in his court at Srirangapatna, extending its reach to Bengaluru as a governed city within Mysore state. Revenue collection, policing, military supervision, judicial oversight, communications, which by the way included a certain element of espionage, and weights and measures, were each assigned to a different identifiable official operating within a set hierarchy. Each official's authority derived from the office he held, rather than from some sort of personal patronage or royal favor that is subject to royal whimsy. It was a sea change in the way administration was done, and that is the way we understand administration to be today. For Bengaluru, this was the first occasion on which the city was governed, not as a special case, not as a jagir, not as a military assignment, but as part of a standardized administrative grid. Officials stationed in the city knew their chain of command. They understood their authority, and they understood that their authority had to be legible, and Bengaluru, the city, became administratively dependable. To this day, the Attara Kacheri in Cubbon Park is one of the most recognizable and iconic buildings in modern Bengaluru. Among the 18 departments, the Department of Expedition administered what Chikka Devaraja called the Anche, the postal system. The historian Mark Wilkes, who studied it closely, made a distinction that sort of illustrates or illuminates its true purpose. Now, a normal postal system passively delivers intelligence. Chikka Deva's Anche was designed to actively obtain it. Its officials were not merely postal workers, but formally constituted confidential agents of the state, spies. Their subordinates were professional informants, all of them embedded in the administrative machinery. The system monitored not only public disturbances, but the financial condition and the private conduct of districts and officials, capable of detecting secret transactions and early signs of disorder. This was the first signs of Big Brother is watching. The speed with which reports now reached the capital itself was a political instrument. The knowledge that provincial developments, things that happened at the outskirts, would be known at the court quickly, acted as a deterrent against conspiracy and defiance. The Anche system outlasted Chikka Deva's reign. It was later adapted and tightened by Hyder Ali, and its presence in Bengaluru is recorded in the name that survives to this day. Anche Pete is a block within the old Bengaluru Pete, named for the postal services that operated out of there. Chikka Deva also standardized weights and measures across the kingdom, including a royal seal that bore his monogram, and that monogram certified fair trade in all market centers. Now then he formalized 19 different types of taxes on houses, on looms, and on marriages among them. And he established 12 essential village officials to manage rural administration. The revenues that were generated by these reforms were substantial. Chikka Devaraja is recorded as having amassed a reserve out of all this of 9-crore varahas, earning him the nickname that has endured through the centuries, Navakoti Narayana, which means the Lord of 9 crores. Externally, Chikka Deva maintained a deliberately pro-Mughal diplomatic posture, sending an embassy to Aurangzeb in 1699 and receiving imperial honors in return. With Mughal pressure neutralized through this act of diplomacy, Mysore could concentrate its military attention on the Maratha threat from the north without fear of a second front from the Mughals. In 1696, Mysore forces successfully repelled an advance by the Maratha commander Santaji Ghorpade, who tried to advance upon Srirangapatna. The victory confirmed the defensive logic. Maratha attention was redirected towards frontier cities rather than the Mysore capital. Bengaluru, which Chikka Deva anyway had wanted it to be the first line of defense, was that. It bore the weight of that attention in the decades that followed. By the time Chikka Deva died in 1704, Bengaluru had been made governable in a way that it had never been before. It had a fortified military core, a temple at its heart, a standardized administrative grid that covered revenue, policing, justice, and intelligence, standardized weights and measures, a treasury of 9 crore, and a lineage of institutional trust running all the way back to the Kantheerava varaha, the coin his grandfather had first struck on the 26th of April 1645, in a year when Mysore had decided to be its own master. So if Kempe Gowda gave Bengaluru its birth, its grid, its gates, its market, its logic of circulation, then Chikka Devaraja Wadiyar gave it its maturity and its future. He transformed a city that had survived by being useful to whoever held it into a city that a state needed, invested in, and would defend. But what he could not provide was a successor equal to what he had built. Coming up in the next episode, I will take you through what happens when a well-built, well-provisioned state like Mysore is left without a strong sovereign, when power migrated to ministers and then to generals, and that is when the age of the Dalawais began. And I will take you through all those fascinating years very soon. I am Ramjee Chandran, and this is the history of Bangalore.